Hey everyone. This is the last two chapters of Babe, so we only have 20 pages left. I'm going to finish the book today. And chapter 11, which I'll read first, is called Today is the Day. The day, when it dawned, was just that little too bit bright. On the opposite side of the valley, the trees and houses and haystacks stood out clearly against the background in that three-dimensional way that means rain later. Farmer Hoggett came out and sniffed the air and looked around. Then he went inside to fetch waterproof clothing. Fly knew the moment that she set her eyes on the boss that this was the day. Dogs have lived so long with humans that they know what's going to happen. Sometimes even before owners do. She woke Babe. Today, she said. Today what, Mum? Said Babe sleepily. Today is the day of the Grand Challenge Sheepdog Trial, said Fly proudly, which you, dear, she added in a confident voice, are going to win. With a bit of luck, she thought, and tenderly she licked the end of his snout. She looked critically at the rest of him, anxious as any mother that her child should look right, as if he is to appear in public. Oh, Babe, she said, your coat's in an awful mess. What have you been doing with yourself? You look just as though you've been wallowing in the duck pond. Yes. You mean you have? Yes, Mum. Fly was on the point of saying that puppies don't do such things when she remembered that he was, after all, a pig. Well, I don't know about large white, she said. You've certainly grown enormous, but it's anyone's guess what color you are under all that muck. Whatever's to be done? Immediately her question was answered. Come, pig, said Hoggett's voice from the yard, and when they came out of the stables there stood the farmer, with hosepipe and scrubbing brush and pails of soapy water. Half an hour later, when a beautifully clean, shining Babe stood happily dripping while Hoggett brushed out the tassel of his tightly curled tail till it looked like candy floss, Mrs. Hoggett stuck her head out of the kitchen window. There's Farmer Hoggett cleaning Babe. Breakfast ready, she called. But what in the world you doing with that pig, taking him to a pig show or something? I thought you was going to drive up and watch the trials today. Anybody think you was going to enter him in that way? You've gone and done up. He wouldn't be a sheepdog. He'd be a sheep pig, wouldn't he? Who ever heard of such a thing? I must be daft, though it's you that's daft, really, carrying him about in that poor Land Rover the size of it now. The bottom will fall out. I shouldn't wonder. You ain't surely going to drive all that way with him in the back just so he can watch. No, said Farmer Hoggett. Mrs. Hoggett considered this answer for a moment with her mouth open, while raising and lowering her eyebrows, shaking her head and drumming on the windowsill with her fingertips. Then she closed her mouth and the window. After breakfast she came out to see them off. Fly was sitting in the passenger seat. Babe was comfortable in a thick bed of clean straw in the back, where he now took up the whole space. Mrs. Hoggett walked around the Land Rover, giving out farewell pats. Good boy, she said to Babe, and good girl, she said to Fly, and to Hoggett, goodbye, and have you got your sandwiches and your thermos of coffee and your raincoat? It looks as though it might rain, though I felt a spot of just now. I suppose it might be different where you are going, seeing as it's 100 miles away. That reminds me, have you got enough gas, or have you not got enough money to get some if you have to? I'll see what I can do. Meantime, drive carefully. See you later. 2 o'clock, said Hoggett, and before his wife had time to say anything, added, on the telly, live, and put the Land Rover into gear and drove away. When Mrs. Hoggett switched the television on at 2 o'clock, the first thing in the picture that she noticed was that it was raining hard. She dashed outside to bring her washing in, saw that the sun was shining, and remembered it wasn't wash day anyway, and came back to find the camera showing the layout of the course. First, there was the shot of a huge pillar of stone, the height of a man, standing upright in the ground. Here, said the voice of the commentator, is where each handler will stand, and from here each dog will start his outrun. He can go left or right to get into position behind his sheep. Today each dog will have 10 sheep to work. They will be grouped near that distant post called the holding post. All the time the cameras followed his explanations. And then he must fetch his sheep through the fetch gates all the way back to the handler's post and around it. Then the dog drives the sheep away, to the left as we look at it, through the drive-away gates, turns them right again, and straight across the line of his fetch, through the cross-drive gates and right again to the shedding ring, and when he's shed his sheep and collected them again, then finally he must pen them here. And there's a diagram of the course. Mouthy old thing, said Mrs. Hoggett, turning the sound off. Some folk never know how to hold their tongues, keeping on and on about them silly gates. Why don't he show us a picture of the spectators? Might catch a glimpse of Hoggett and Fly, you never knows. Though not the pig, I hopes. He's surely not daft enough to walk about with that pig. Can't see why he wanted to take him all the way there just to lie in the back of the Land Rover. He'd have done better to leave him here and have him sit and watch it on the telly in comfort, which is more than some of us have got time for. I got work to do, she said, and she stomped off into the kitchen, shaking her head madly. On the silent screen, the first handler walked out and took up his position beside the great sarsen stone, his dog standing beside him, tense and eager in the pouring rain. Chapter 12, That'll Do. Hundreds and thousands of pairs of eyes watched that first dog, but none more keenly than those of Hoggett, Fly, and Babe. The car park was a big sloping field overlooking the course, and the farmer had driven the Land Rover to the topmost corner, well away from other cars. From inside, the three so different faces watched intently. Conditions, Hoggett could see immediately, were very difficult. In addition to the driving rain, which made the going slippery and the sheep more obstinate than usual, there was quite a strong wind blowing almost directly from the holding post back toward the handler, and the dog was finding it hard to hear commands. The more anxious the dog was, the more the sheep tried to break from him, and thus the angrier he became. It was a vicious cycle, and when at last the 10 sheep were penned and the handler pulled the gate shut and cried, "That'll do," no one was surprised that they had scored no more than 70 points out of a possible 100. So it went on. Man after man came to stand beside the great sarsen stone. Men from the north and from the west, from Scotland and Wales and Ireland, with dogs, large and small, rough-coated and smooth, black and white or gray or brown or blue. Merle. Some fared better than others, were steadier on their sheep or had steadier sheep to deal with. But still, as Farmer Hoggett's turn grew near, as luck would have it, he was last to go, there was no score higher than 85. At home, Mrs. Hoggett chanced to turn on the sound of the television back up in time to hear the commentator confirm this. "One more to go," he said, "and the target to beat is 85 points, set by Mr. Jones from Wales and his dog Bryn, a very creditable total, considering the appalling weather conditions we have up here. It's very hard to imagine that score being beaten, but here comes the last competitor to try and do just that." And suddenly there appeared on the screen before Mrs. Hoggett's eyes the tall, long, striding figure of her husband, walking out toward the great stone with tubby old Fly at his heels. "This is Mr. Hoggett with Pig," said the commentator. "A bit of a strange name, that, but then I must say his dog's rather on the fat side. Hullo, he's sending the dog back. What on earth? Oh, good heavens, will you look at that?" And as Mrs. Hoggett and hundreds of thousands of other viewers looked, they saw Fly go trotting back toward the car park, and from it, cantering through the continuing rain, came the long, lean, beautifully clean figure of a large white pig. Straight to Hoggett's side ran Babe, and stood like a statue, his ears fanned, his little eyes fixed upon the distant sheep. At home, Mrs. Hoggett's mouth opened wide, but for once, no sound came out of it. On the course, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then a great burst of noise. On the screen, the camera showed every aspect of the amazing scene, the spectators pointing, gaping, grinning, the red-faced judges hastily conferring, Hoggett and Babe waiting patiently, and finally, the commentator. "This is really quite ridiculous," he said with a shame-faced smile, "but in point of fact, there seems to be nothing in the rule book that says only sheep-dogs may compete. So it looks as though the judges are bound to allow Mr. Hoggett to run this, sheep-pig, I suppose we'll have to call it. Ha ha! One look at it and the sheep will disappear into the next county without a doubt. Still, we might as well end the day with a good laugh." And indeed, at that moment, a great gale of laughter arose as Hoggett, receiving a most unwilling nod from the judges, said quietly, "Away to me, pig," and Babe began his outrun to the right. How they roared at the mere sight of him running, though many noticed how fast he went. And at the purely crazy thought of a pig herding sheep, and especially at the way he squealed and squealed at the top of his voice in foolish excitement, they supposed. But though he was excited, tremendously excited at the thrill of actually competing in the grand challenge sheepdog trials, Babe was nobody's fool. He was yelling out the password, I may be you, I may be ram, I may be mutton, maybe lamb, but on the hoof or on the hook, I ain't so stupid as I look, as he ran. This was the danger point. Before he'd met his sheep, and again he repeated the magic words, shouting above the noise of wind and rain, his eyes fixed on the 10 sheep by the holding post. Their eyes were just as fixed on him, eyes that bulged at the sight of this great strange animal approaching, but they held steady, and now the distant crowd fell suddenly silent as they saw the pig take up a perfect position behind his sheep, and heard the astonished judges award 10 points for a faultless outrun. Just for luck, in case they hadn't believed their ears, Babe gave the password one last time. I ain't so stupid as I look, he panted, and a very good afternoon to you all. I do apologize for having to ask you to work in this miserable weather. I hope you'll forgive me. At once, as he hoped, there was a positive babble of voices. Fancy him knowing the password. What lovely manners. Not like them nasty wolves. What do you want us to do, young master? Quickly, for he was conscious that the time was ticking away, Babe, first asking politely for their attention, outlined the course to them. And I would be really most grateful, he said, if you would bear all these points in mind, keep tightly together, go at a good steady pace, not too fast, not too slow, and walk exactly through the middle of each of the 3 gates if you'd be good enough. The moment I enter the shedding ring with the 4 of you who are wearing collars, how nice they look by the way, please walk out of it, and then if you'd all go kindly so straight to the final pen, I should be so much obliged. All this talk took quite a time, and the crowd and the judges and Mrs. Hoggett and her hundreds of thousands of fellow viewers began to feel that nothing else was going to happen, that the sheep were never going to move, that the whole thing was a stupid farce, a silly joke that had fallen flat. Only Hoggett, standing silent in the rain beside the sarsen stone, had complete confidence in the skills of the sheep pig. And suddenly, the miracle began to happen. Marching 2 by 2, as steady as guardsmen on parade, the 10 sheep set off for the French gates, Babe a few paces behind them, silent, powerful, confident. Straight as a die, they went toward the distant Hoggett, straight between the exact center of the fetch gates, without a moment's hesitation, without deviating an inch from their unswerving course. Hoggett said nothing, made no sign, no whistle, did not move as the sheep rounded him so closely as almost to brush his boots, and the fetch completed, set off for the drive-away gates, once again their pace never changing, looking neither to the left nor to the right, keeping so tight a formation that you could have dropped a big tablecloth over the lot. They passed through the precise middle of the drive-away gates and turned as one animal to face the cross-drive gates. It was just the same here. The sheep passed through perfectly and wheeled for the shedding ring, while all the time the judges' scorecards showed maximum points, and the crowd watched in a kind of hypnotized hush, whispering to one another for fear of breaking the spell. He's not put a foot wrong. Bang through the middle of every gate. Lovely steady pace. And the handler, he's not said a word, not even moved, just stood there, leaning on a stick. Ah, but he'll have to move now. You're never going to tell me that pig can shed 4 sheep out of the tent on his own. The shedding ring was circled perhaps 40 yards in diameter, marked up by little heaps of sawdust, and into it the sheep walked, still calm, still collected, and stood waiting. Outside the circle, Babe waited, his eyes on Hoggett. The crowd waited. Mrs. Hoggett waited. Hundreds of thousands of viewers waited. Then, just as it seemed nothing more would happen, that the man had somehow lost control of the sheep pig, that the sheep pig had lost interest in his sheep, Farmer Hoggett raised his stick, and with it gave one sharp tap upon the great sarsen stone, a tap that sounded like a pistol shot in the tent's atmosphere. And at this signal, Babe walked gently into the circle and up to his sheep. Beautifully done, he said to them quietly. I can't tell you how grateful I am to you all. Now, if the 4 ladies with collars would kindly walk out of the ring when I give a grunt, I should be so much obliged. Then, if you would all be good enough to wait until my boss has walked across the field to the collecting pen over there and opened his gate, all that remains for you to do is pop in. Would you do that, please? Arr, they said softly, as Babe gave one deep grunt. The 4 collared sheep detached themselves from their companions and calmly, unhurriedly, walked out of the shedding ring. Unmoving, held by the magic of the moment, the crowd watched with no sound but a great sigh of amazement. No one could quite believe his eyes. No one seemed to notice that the wind had dropped and the rain had stopped. No one was surprised when a single shaft of sunshine came suddenly through a hole in the gray clouds and shone full upon the great sarsen stone. Slowly, with his long strides, Hoggett left it and walked to the little enclosure of hurdles, the final test of his shepherding. He opened its gate and stood silent still, while the animals walked back into the ring to rejoin the rest. Then he nodded once to Babe, no more, and steadily, smartly, straightly, the 10 sheep, with the sheep pig at their heels, marched into the final pen, and Hoggett closed the gate. As he dropped the loop of rope over the hurdle stake, everyone could see the judge's marks. 100 out of 100, the perfect performance, never before reached by man and dog in the whole history of sheepdog trials, but now achieved by man and pig, and everyone went mad. At home, Mrs. Hoggett erupted like a volcano into a great lava flow of words, pouring them out toward the 2 figures held by the camera, as though they were actually inside that box in the corner of her sitting room, cheering them, praising them, congratulating first one and then the other, telling them how proud she was to hurry home and not to be late for supper. It was shepherd's pie. As for the crowd of spectators at the Grand Challenge sheepdog trials, they shouted and yelled and waved their arms and jumped about, while the astonished judges scratched their heads and the amazed competitors shook theirs in wondering disbelief. "Marvelous, marvelous," bleated the 10-penned sheep. And from the back of an ancient Land Rover at the top of the car park, a tubby old black and white collie, her plumed tail wagging wildly, barked and barked and barked for joy. In all the hubbub of noise and excitement, 2 figures still stood silently side by side. Then Hoggett bent, and gently watching Babe between his great ears, uttered those words that every handler always says to his working companion when the job is finally done. Perhaps no one else heard the words, but if they did, there was no doubting the truth of them. "That'll do," said Farmer Hoggett to his sheep pig. "That'll do."